Welcome to our Derivan Artist Talks. Make sure your phones are on silent, please.
I don't think I'll get any calls, but just in case. What do I do with it? Somewhere in there.
So today we'd like to welcome Caroline Josephs, who's going to share with us her trip that she just did to south of France to Matisse's villa, and also she did an artist-in-residency in
Vytlacil
in upstate New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza. Okay. Well, lovely to see you here, and let's go on a bit of a journey. The first one is to Vytlacil, and it's about an hour's drive out of New York City and out of a little village called Sparkle, and it's part of the Art Students League of New York, which is the very big, enormously interesting and wonderful art school in New York City, which is 150 years old, has probably 300 tutors and lots of amazing work. Anyway, Vytlacil is the place that was bequeathed by an artist and his family. Vytlacil was the artist, and this charming old double-storied house is part of 15 acres, and it has become the artist-in-residency place for artists. So anybody who is interested can apply, and I did and was accepted. They have various ways in which they accept you as an artist. A couple of the people who were there with me, there were 7 of us all together over a month. Sometimes people stay for 2 months. 3 of those, I think, 3 or 4 were working 20 hours a week for their keep there. And so they have in the old house a couple of artist studios. There's a sculpture studio and a ceramics studio. And then I wanted to go back, but I'm not sure if I can go back. I flipped forward. Anyway, there's 4 purpose-built artist studios, each with their own living quarters as well. And I had a wonderful studio, very big, which I wanted to bring home with me, and a little living space with its own little deck and a kitchen and a place to sleep and a bathroom and so on. So this is Vytlacil early morning, and it's also, it was beautiful, lots of coloured leaves. It was May, so it was spring, and there were wild turkeys and eagles flying overhead and groundhogs and all, and the domestic fowls. It was really a communal feeling. There were staff there who were looking after us and encouraging community, but they left us to our own devices, so we're perfectly free to work all night or all day or do whatever we liked, walk in the forest or sit on the deck. Here we have Liddy, who shared part of the space in my big studio, and here are 2 of the domestic chooks who are lying in the sun head to head, which was pretty funny to see, actually. Liddy was from the Dominican Republic and did marvellous sort of drawings. A fairly short walk through the forest and you're at this huge cemetery that was very quiet and very beautiful, and then you could walk right up the hill through all the gravestones and look at all the different people and see the Hudson River from there. So that's really the setting. This is Liddy and Elizabeth, who was from Atlanta, Georgia. And they're in Sparkle, which is just a short walk down the road from the campus, with two of the rather beautiful houses behind from the little village of Sparkle. So when I knew that I was going to go to Vytlacil, and I had been showing for the previous, I think 3 years. Was this my third year? I think this might have been my third year, showing at a gallery in New York, at the Agora Gallery in Chelsea, where they have a group exhibition of Australian and New Zealand artists every year. And so I've been included in that. But so I'd been going back to New York each year, and this was my fourth visit to New York City. I wanted to think about how I would be working at Vytlacil before I got there. So I began to think my way into that, and this was probably one of a series. I'm interested particularly in migration patterns and culture contact and all those sorts of things. So this one's called Exile Seeks Refuge, and it's big, about so big, 1.5 by about, I don't know, 2 meters, I think. And I did this sort of before as a part of a series, and it led me to think about the whole Manhattan setting. This one I did around the time of Hurricane Sandy, and I was also at the same time thinking about the Native American people in Manhattan and how they had been from the early 1600s kind of washed away, if you like. The motif of liberty, the Statue of Liberty, began to enter into my paintings, and I was very taken by the whole history of how that statue had come from the French to New York City, how the whole idea of liberty and Manhattan and New York was sort of woven together. And then the history that isn't talked about at all when you're there, which is, and there's not a very evident presence of Native American Indians or what their stories are. So I was reading and thinking about all that, and here we have, well, whatever you like to see. I asked my granddaughter what she saw, and she said, somebody's on a big wave and they're giving a gift to somebody else. And I thought, oh yeah, well, maybe they thought they were indeed. That was part of the story. This is another one that I did just prior to leaving for New York. And I guess I was again thinking about the Statue of Liberty, which has on its base this very well-known song. It's called the Statue of Liberty song. And it starts out, and I'm sure most of you will have heard it, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." And it goes on. And I suppose I had this image of Statue of Liberty as a way of migrants coming to a new birth, in a way, to a new life, and the holding up of the Constitution and so on, the lamp, and the kind of background of the Native American Indians, what was happening to them, I don't know. So this is my studio in Vytlacil, and it was beautiful, as you can see, with these great big windows looking out on this fabulous forest. Behind that wall was Liddy doing her big drawings on brown paper, very powerful ink drawings. The first one I did was this one you can see behind me, which I called the checkerboard of life. And it was based on, I'd been also looking at the African American history in terms of Manhattan, and I was kind of struck by the fact that I had never realized that the first slaves were brought to Manhattan in the early 1600s by the Dutch, and that the slaves constituted finally in the early 18th century about 1 in 5 of every person in Manhattan, and they were the people who built New York City. On the basis of a lot of that labour, a lot of the flattening of the hills and gullies, the making of the grid system over the top of Manhattan had been done by African Americans and as slaves, and they weren't freed until really into the 18th century. And then, because I had thought, probably like lots of people, that slavery only occurred in the South in America, but that wasn't true. So that was the beginning. When we went to the African Memorial, which is on the south part of Manhattan, down near where Twin Towers used to be, I discovered that there had been, while they were excavating to create a new skyscraper, a commercial one, they discovered 900 black African bodies, a burial ground, and work stopped because there was such a furor and protest about going on with the work without knowing. So they found more and more and more in coffins usually. And because the African American people were not able to bury their dead within the city limits, and it was really just by accident that there had been, I think it was a street that had been left, and it actually documented African burial ground. So when the archaeologists started to dig, they found more and more of the artifacts and body skeletons, that were left 200 years before, had been buried there. So finally they stopped the work, they left a part for a permanent memorial to these people, and the building that had been going to go up was contained within a smaller space. And this is just how do I go back? Oh, it's going forward. Can I go back? Previous, here we go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, those arrows there.
Wait on, which one?
This one.
Oh, this one. So on this painting, this is really like a universal situation, I think. Who's on top? Who has the power? Who has the influence? Who makes the decisions? And there was an image that had stayed with me from the African burial ground, which was a ship, from a ship. And I guess it was a painting. I'm really not sure, because all I have on my images is this very blurred image, and there was bodies cramped into a ship hold. So the people who were like the trading in slaves would cram as many people into a ship as possible, knowing that many of them would die en route before they got to Manhattan. So they were really confined, and I based this piece on the map of Manhattan, which kind of I also wanted to suggest something of a ship as well as the map, and as well as how power gets corrupted in the world. So here is just the documentation that the archaeologists came up with of the different coffins. Lots and lots of children. They could tell whether they were male or female, and so on. So in Vytlacil, I had a delightful group of artist colleagues. This is Cecilia Roberts, who came originally from Kansas. I met her whole family, and she's a very talented young artist who is a portraitist and does commissions and is very keen and very talented. And we've kept in touch because I said I would like to Skype with her, and because I've been an educator for most of my life, I said, if you can teach me how to do portraits, I'll teach you how to be a teacher. So anyway, that's the beginning of her portrait of me. And she did a number of portraits of her boyfriend, and this is how it finished. And I found it quite amazing. I'd sit with her and she'd be chatting, and she'd have a handful of brushes and her little palette, and she'd be talking to me and asking questions and having this long conversation. And in a way, I couldn't work like that, but I appreciated what she could do. This is in her studio. And when I look at that myself, I see a kaleidoscope of about 4 of my aunts in my own face there. So it's kind of like, oh my God, there's my aunts, which is quite lovely. There she is doing one of the workers who looked after the garden, and the veggie garden in particular, and did all sorts of hard physical work, was Elena and her little boy Orion. So this is Cecilia starting the portrait she did of Elena and the little boy. And anyway, so just before we went to Vytlacil, Donald and I went up to Philadelphia, where my intention was to see one painting of Matisse's. But en route to see that, which I'll talk a little bit about later, we came across another museum where they had big screens outside, and there were actresses and actors reenacting parts of history. And this particular image was a young woman talking about slaves who escaped. So in 1799, George Washington enacted an act called the Fugitive Act, which allowed slave owners to go after their runaway slaves and bring them back and punish them, and usually very severely and often publicly. And I was taken by the story of Oni Judge, and also inspired by Cecilia's portraits. I had never done a portrait, but I thought, I'm going to try a portrait. So this is a very big canvas again, sort of like about so big. And on the left is Oni Judge, who was in one of these films I saw in Philadelphia being enacted by an actress. So we don't know what she looked like exactly, but she lived in the late 18th, early, and well into the 19th century, because she lived into her 80s. She was the maid and slave of Mrs. George Washington, Mrs. Martha Washington, and she'd lost all her family. Her whole family had been picked up from a plantation in Virginia and taken to be slaves by the Washingtons. So she ran away, and she was harboured by freed slaves in the north. Washington had just enacted this Fugitive Act. He sent everything after her and all kinds of inducements. Come back here, and when Mrs. Washington and I die, you will be free. And she said, well, why would I come back when I'm already free? And he couldn't find her or, bring her back in any way. So she lived on and got married, had children, lost all her children and her husband. So it was a very tragic life. So I was taken by her story. I thought, that's some woman, to be living through such adversity and to still have the will and the power to, to survive. The other woman in this picture was a black artist that I met by chance in the Museum of Art and Design, which is just near Columbus Circle in New York City. And it was just before I went up to Vytlacil, and I was by myself, and I wandered up to where there were artists, kind of artists in residence, and she was there and just packing up at the end of the day. And we got into a conversation, and it was very interesting. She had been an ethnomusicologist, she had been an industrial designer, and then someone taught her to crochet, and she began to crochet these amazing sculptural hats and wearing apparel and mandalas and all kinds of things. And she was influenced, of course, she didn't know who her ancestors were, but she'd obviously come from Africa originally, or her ancestors had. She was influenced also by Native American art, by Chinese meditation, by funk. So she brought all these things into it. And I thought she was just a fabulous woman, and her work was fantastic. So I put these two women together from two different periods, and I wanted, for me, it was a sense of Zenobia Bailey is her name, and you can look up if you're interested in her work on the web. I didn't want to portray her face because I had tried to email her and get her permission, but I had no reply. So I thought I quite like the fact of her not being quite, sort of obscured in some way. And then people asked me, why has she got white arms if she's African American? And I said, well, I'm not sure, but part of it might be, from the work I've done with Indigenous people here, that the white signifies the bones, the absolute core of the spirit. And I believed that her work was about bringing her ancestors into being, bringing herself into being in a way, but that whole idea, so which I took from what I knew of native cultures. So that was what also happened at Vytlacil after we'd been there a week or so, was that they invited famous artists, big-time artists, to come and critique our work. So here we have, from your left here, Gary Sussman, who is the director of Vytlacil, a wonderful man, a fabulous storyteller. You drop him a question and he'd just go off into all sorts of philosophical and stories of his life and people and art and all sorts of things. So he was a great boon, and very much looking after everybody to make sure that there was a real sense of community there. He's a famous sculptor as well, and so he does big commissions and so on as well. So he wasn't there all the time, but he came, and here we were at every week on a Wednesday we would have lunch, and then there's Mark Safran, who did beautiful surreal stuff, and Hans Vichte, who does extraordinary. He was a cripple. I was warned he was a genius. They were all extremely fabulous to get feedback. They all told you different things, completely different. Sometimes contrary, the contradiction of what the other one said, but, that was to remind us that whatever people say about art, it's opinion mostly. Sometimes there's a convergence of opinion. This was one I called it Emergence. It was really just, I also was doing these small prints, monoprints, and out of that work came this, which I collaged together, just because it happened to look like something that pleased me. So on the wall here you can see the small monoprints that I was doing. And I did about 60 of those, and also about 4 big canvases. So the 2 you've seen, and this one with me working on it, was really, it's called I Was Bessie Abramovitz Before He Was Sidney Hillman. And it's really linking into American labour history and also my own family history, where my own grandfather was linked in some way that I haven't been able to find out, to Sidney Hillman, who was Roosevelt's socialist labour advisor, and Bessie Abramovitz, who was his wife, and they had the first big clothing workers' strike. She initiated it, and then he joined in, and he became very famous, and she's not so famous. But I wanted to do a portrait of her as well and link it with all these other things. So there's lots of big buttons because they were all associated with both, my grandfather and Sidney Hillman and Bessie were all involved in tailoring. They're all Jewish, of course. They all came from Russia in the 19th century. So there were, I think, links between them. So that was my third painting, big one. And at the end of our time at Vytlacil, we had open studios. About 60 people came. And what delighted me more than anything else was this couple. He was a portraitist, and they were originally, their people were from Africa, I think from Togo. But they loved my piece with the 2 black women, and that was enormously satisfying for me. They just hung around and chatted about it and wanted to know more and more. So that was rather lovely. There we are. This is Ramiro Davola, who was from Argentina, and he did very quirky little cartoon things. There he is with his mother and his girlfriend. And he was a delight. We'd all meet, the artists, almost every evening and share food, bring food, and sit in my studio, which was the biggest, or on the veranda or around the fire. And this is Liddy from the Dominican Republic. She, as I say, did these wonderful, really powerful ink drawings, always looking for the cheapest way to do it, so she was working on cardboard boxes she found, which was really effective, and all sorts of brown paper and so on. This is Laurie from New York. She'd been a school teacher. She had decided to leave that and go full-time into sculpting. She spent 4 years in Florence studying classical sculpture, and she's now doing commissions. So you can see a couple of her examples there. I think that guy on her left was in ballet. but fabulous work, amazing. This is in the middle of Vytlacil was the exhibition in New York. So this was part of my Manhattan series. The artist leaps into New York. This is again a big canvas, acrylic on canvas, and that was the one I showed in the group exhibition. Here we are at the exhibition with another, this woman on my right there is Sylvia Ditchburn, who comes from Queensland, and just standing in front of the painting at the opening. And here are the beautiful women of Agora Gallery who do all the work. There's a whole team of them, and if people are interested in applying to show in New York, this is a good place to look. At the end of our time, we went on an excursion in a little bus. Our bus driver is Peter, who's their second there. And some of the other artists, including Rudy, you haven't seen, who was doing self-portraits. And that was 300 Acres, Storm King it's called. We were taken to this sculpture park. Fabulous, very famous sculptors like Andy Goldsworthy have 2 pieces there, and massive works. Really interesting, I think. So, that's the end of Vytlacil. And we now kind of swap. We came back, and about 3.5 weeks later, we went off to France to paint in Matisse's villa, the Villa Le Rêve in Vence. And it's where Matisse lived as he was getting to be quite an old man, from 1943 to 1949. He was quite sick at the time. He was avoiding the war, and so he took up residence in this villa, and that's where we took up residence with Wendy Sharp as our mentor. And there was a group of a dozen artists who gathered there. This is the view, really a close-up of the distant view of Vence, which was just a short walk away, the village, the old village. Beautiful, beautiful village. And I mean, endlessly full of little cobbled streets and beautiful roofs and doorways that were ancient, medieval. This is the back of the villa, the view of the back of the villa with the big grey mountain, rocky. So, you know, very mountainous kind of area. Here's Wendy on day one. We're in the garden, and she's showing us how to use gouache, and which we'd all brought our own paper and brushes and materials. And we had beautiful food, which was in itself a work of art and a delight. We had this wonderful woman here, Brigitte, who was a traditional French regional cook who'd been brought in. So 3 times a day she would come and do the most glorious meals. And her husband and her daughter helped. But she was something, I tell you. And the food was extraordinary, beautiful. So we sat out in the garden under an awning, not this one, and had all these, this is stuffed peppers, but the presentation, you know, was just beautiful. Bowls of roses on the table, the last night petals, and she would give a demonstration of how you served each thing and all the accoutrements, and so it was delicious. another form of art, I think. And, you know, when you look at that, when I looked at that, I went, oh, I want to paint that, you know. So we all wanted to take her home as well. Along the road was the chapel where Matisse, who's pictured there, was invited to design the chapel, small chapel of an order of nuns. And he did the big murals and the stained glass windows, the chasubles for the priests, all of that. And because he had, this young woman, he had advertised for a nurse. He wanted a pretty woman because he wanted also to use her as a model. This is before she became a nun. She came to look after him as a nurse, as a young woman, and he did some paintings of her. But I think, you know, he was very fond of her. And then when she became a nun in this order, she came to him and said, would you help us to design this new chapel? And he took it on for really the last part of his life. Very big job, but it's really a lovely little chapel. There's some more stained glass windows and one of the murals that's a very Matisse sort of drawing on tiles all along that wall of the Stations of the Cross. This is the Barnes Foundation, which houses a private collection of the amazing collection in Philadelphia that we made a pilgrimage to, Donald and I, over the one day, as I told you. My intention was particularly to see one painting of Matisse's, which was 15 metres by 3.5 metres. And it's called La Danse. It has quite a story. And I incorporated, I sort of played, this is my image that I took of the villa, worked on taking the idea of La Danse, which is huge and big and has these 3 like vaulted, almost semicircular, and then dancing figures. I left out some of his figures and I changed them a little bit. But he had rented a specially big place to work on this. Barnes was a squillionaire who was a doctor in America who'd commissioned Matisse to do this painting. Barnes had interestingly made his fortune from a drug for gonorrhea. And anyway, he thought himself to be a connoisseur of art and an art critic. And unfortunately, the first one that Matisse did was based on the wrong measurements. He'd been given the wrong measurements, so it was about 1 metre out. That one now is housed in a Paris museum. He spent 2 years working on it before he realised that it was the wrong size. And so he took the piece, or it was transported to Barnes. Barnes never wanted to show it. He was very chary about people going and looking at it. When Matisse finally got in to look at it where it had been hung, he was kind of so stressed by that he lost consciousness and fell on the floor. And Barnes revived him with whiskey, apparently. Anyway, that's the story behind it that I thought was very interesting. But it's this extraordinary thing because he did it with cutouts, and I wanted to experiment with his form of cutouts. And so this work is a bit of a painting behind and then collaged the figure, which we had already been to 3 major exhibitions of Chagall, who also lived in the vicinity, and a major exhibition of Matisse's. And so I had this kind of spirit of Chagall and Matisse and the painting, which interests me particularly, and I wanted to experiment a little bit with cutout and see what happened. So this is another one I did, and just sort of experimenting. Wendy was encouraging us to use blocks of colour, not necessarily realistic at all, but just to see what happened when you change that around. And so I wanted to try one with different colours and with this Chagall Matisse kind of spirit kind of coming out of the window. So that's it. So I'd like to invite you, if you've got any questions for me that we can work with, or comments or thoughts, or anything that relates to your own work. Or well, I'd like to exhibit some of the work. I think they go in very different places. The Vytlacil work has two lots, like the small monoprints. I didn't show you the fourth canvas, which was a big abstract, and because I wanted to finish it when I came home. I finished it now, but it didn't get included. And the small monoprints. So I think they might go together into some exhibition. I'm trying to find a place for them. And also the three big ones, which are based on history, I think go in either a university or a museum or something related, where they're interested in race relations or something like that. So I'm working on trying to find a place for them. And then the Vence ones are really kind of more playful and, you know, working with colour for me in a different way, and gouache I'd never used before, so that was interesting to use that. And very much as a precursor to using it for travelling, because really terrific for that, you know, that it's like watercolour, but it's opaque, and you can actually go over things, and if you don't like black, you can make it white, and whatever you like, really. So yes, I would like to exhibit them, but not sure how I'm beginning to get a sense. We've only been back about 3 weeks, so to get a sense of where I'm going with some of this work. So I've already started to experiment with the monoprints into big ones, and how I might show them together and where I can do that. I do have a gallery called the Art Atrium in Bondi Junction here, and I do have a piece in the Jewish Museum at the moment, but the Jewish Museum is really just part of addressing Sydney Jews in fashion and design, because my grandfather was a tailor, and I happen to have a painting, but it's not for sale or anything, it's just part of the thing. And so I'm working on getting them on the wall in some gallery or other, but I don't know where.
Those monoprints were on circles. What were those circles that you were producing?
Well, I don't print them as circles. I just cut them into circles. So I'm printing them on paper, and I'm working with colour and chance, really. They're not figurative at all. So all kinds of things happen with the paint, and it's a wonderful way for me to just puddle in lots of paint and try out different colour combinations and slightly different techniques with how I print them. And then I've been mounting them, getting them mounted, you know, with this circular thing. But I'm going to try different arrangements now, and maybe squares and rectangles as well, and also collaging them onto big pieces. And then how do I do that? And so which kind of background, and how do I paint that? Lots of questions about them. They're very saleable. People love them because they're kind of. And the little ones, like I've just sold a whole lot as single little ones, because they take on people imagine themselves into all these abstracts, and they have a lot of texture, which is very organic, kind of reminding you of plants and trees and underwater and all kinds of stuff. So I don't know where they're going, but they go because I love doing them, and it's a kind of warm-up for me. All right, I'm in my studio with the paint tubes, and great for Matisse, because I go through a lot of paint. and Gary Sussman had suggested to me he said, I want to see one, why don't you put them all on the wall, and rearrange them and so on. And I couldn't do it there because I didn't have enough time to really sit back and look at them and work out the arrangement. And my studio at home is fairly small too, so I have to work with the practicalities, sort of how do I, the limitations that I have to work with as well. So, yeah.
And the works that you did in Matisse's villa, they were much smaller works than they were works on paper.
Yeah, well, we had to carry all our paper and brushes and paints. So the biggest pieces of paper I had were like that. I had a watercolour pad, a really lovely, I treated myself to the best paper. And then what I did was, Donald was there too. He did lots of lovely things. But what I did, because I'm used to work, I like to work big. So I put 4 sheets together when I was in Vence, in the villa, and painted it as one piece. And then I took it apart and put it back in my suitcase. And then when I got home, I stuck it onto a big piece of paper and did it that way. So there were 4 or 5 pieces of paper that stuck together like a collage, on top of which was paint, and then on top of that was collage. So that was to deal with the practicality of how we carry something, and I wanted to do it, not just work on that size all the time when I was there. So I only did that one big one, and I did lots of little ones as well, which I haven't. Oh, I did another big one in 4 pieces, which I might work on at some stage, but haven't. So that's how dealing with the suitcase, weight, blah blah blah. I beg your pardon? I was, for 45 years I was an educator, but I did my first art workshop at the National Art School in 1966, and I absolutely loved that. I'm still friends with the teacher from that, and that was mind-blowing for me. I wasn't allowed to do art at school. If you were in the top class, you had to do Latin and French and German and Maths 1 and blah, blah, blah. And I'd look in the art room and go, oh, I want to do that, but it was only the dummies were allowed to do art in those days. So, it was really, get a proper job stuff. And in 1980s, I went to art school full-time, in between jobs, and I was doing, very big jobs as a curriculum designer, and sometimes across Australia or across the state and so on. I was working in arts education. I was talking to artists. I was working with artists from tertiary institutions and schools and blah, blah, blah. For 6 years of my life, I was concentrated on arts education. Cross-cultural education was also part of my education background, so I was working very much at the cutting edge of that and helped to introduce Asian studies into schools in New South Wales and so on. So yes, it wasn't until I always was doing something, but it was very much in the background, and it wasn't until I started a PhD. When I finished, I decided I wasn't doing any more big jobs. I did a PhD, I incorporated 30 big drawings into that. as well as performance and storytelling and so on. And then when I finished that, I went to a workshop on large-scale narrative drawing, which I found incredibly daunting, but out of that I just kept going. So that was the beginning of 2008, and that's been my major focus, has been drawing and painting since then. So relatively short, you know, I'm what they call an emerging artist.
I wanted to ask you, how did you come to do these residencies? Did you have to seek them out, or someone asked you?
Yeah, I had to apply, so I put in a proposal for a project. So I had to know in advance, really, I had to be able to write and show some of my work and all of that. And they don't have like a committee that meets, you know, like the Australia Council or anything like that. So within 2 weeks they said, yes, you're in. We'll give you what they call reduced fees. And so I had to pay for all my expenses to get there and take my paint and brushes and all that. I took canvases with me, and I bought some other stuff. But yeah, so it was just putting in a proposal really and being accepted.
Was there a particular reason you applied to go to those two places?
Oh, the Vence one, on the other hand, that's different. Okay, so that was organised from Australia. It wasn't an artist-in-residency in that way. We were really doing a workshop with Wendy Sharp, and it was quite expensive. It included all of the busing there and exhibitions and travel and food and, you know, everything really. So, and there were other artists there who were really very well-established professional artists, selling a lot of work, showing, and there were people who were, you know, doing it not so often and more as a hobby. And so there was a range of different people doing it for different reasons, and it was a fabulous opportunity. And to be in that place, which, you know, it's a 600-year-old house next door. We invited the guy in for dinner with us, and it turned out he had met Chagall. His father knew Matisse, you know, like amazing stuff. He was taken off with a friend, I forget, somebody famous, who came to collect him and take him in a helicopter to, where was it? I don't know, the Riviera somewhere, anyway, you know, like another world. All right. Thank you very much.